So my name is Adriano Marini. I'm the Director of Sales and Customer Success here at Cadence Solutions. We are a boutique provider of enterprise content management and information management solutions in the Microsoft domain. And we do a lot of work in public, private, and just in general, any sector across North America and beyond in this exact type of situation. So today we're going to be talking about how we help our clients foster a stable SharePoint environment. And we're joined by our friends from Preservica, who have a really cool tool that we use to help build those stable, secure, and ultimately very well supported SharePoint environments, for all of our clients. Neil?
Yeah, hi everyone. Neil Cruikshanks. I'm based in the UK, so it is evening for me over here. I work in the channel here as a pre-sale solutions architect. So my background's Microsoft. So really, I say my primary role here is kind of trying to blend the world of archiving with that of IT and records managers and that kind of thing. So yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. So let's run through the agenda today. Today we're going to go through kind of 4 topics. The first one will be to introduce Cadence and to introduce Preservica to those who haven't joined us before. We're going to run through a little bit of what are those key issues that affect the stability of SharePoint environments, and stability being a key word there. SharePoint will work and SharePoint will work day to day, but will it be stable? Will it be well governed? Not necessarily. And then we're going to get into how to build that resilient SharePoint environment of your dreams, how to get everything you ever wanted out of SharePoint and more while protecting your organization's information and content that's stored in Microsoft 365. And then we're going to pivot over to a bit more detail on Preserve 365, which is Preservica's key product in this realm, and how it helps to increase the stability and ultimately increase the preservation of records and data stored in 365. This is the first in this series, and we're going to be going deeper into some of these topics in future webinars over the next couple of months. And the next one's going to be all about SharePoint storage capacity. So that's a topic that we're going to talk about and touch on today, but we will have a lot more to say in our future session. So diving right in, the first thing I want to quickly just introduce you to is who is Cadence Solutions, who is the person speaking to you right now, and why should we listen to Adriano? Well, Adriano aside, Cadence is a company that has been around for 14 years, and our specialty is information management, data governance, whatever term you want to use. Information in Microsoft 365 and the Microsoft environment is our playground and the focus of our work. In 2013, our founder, Jordan, was employed at a local municipality here in the Edmonton, Alberta metropolitan region. And essentially what had happened was they hired a big company, tried to implement information management, and it went downhill pretty quick. And seeing the type of quality that was in the market, he decided, well, it's time to do this better and with more quality than ever before. And that is how Cadence was born. And since then, we've been on a journey to help organizations manage information better and be more efficient at making sure that records are protected, usable, secure, and ultimately destroyed at the end of their life when necessary, so that data stays clean and usable for everyone involved. We started our life as an open text partner for many years, but since then, we've since grown into the Microsoft world. And we now have partnerships with Preservica, AvePoint, and a handful of other companies that help build stronger, more resilient Microsoft environments. Microsoft, of course, being the underlying solution that holds the data and makes sure that it is managed very well. We have a couple internal values that we hold ourselves to be extremely, beholden to, I suppose, in how we deliver. We like our people to own our growth. We like our people to be dedicated to excellence. We like our people to achieve together, and we like our people to act with integrity. And those are 4 things that are just at the ethos of how we deliver our projects and how we deliver solutions to our clients, in the sense that, these things weren't necessarily visible in previous projects, and these help shape how we deliver day to day. And since then, over those past 14 years, we've definitely done a lot of different work. This is a lot of different work across a lot of different sectors. This is just a small selection of some of the clients we've assisted in our time, but we've done over 120 projects and migrated over 750 million documents in our time thus far. And that is into OpenText, into Microsoft, into solutions that help structure and help govern.
Because so we've been in the preservation game for over 20 years. You can see from the, some of the logos that are on the screen. We deal with from almost all organizations, all verticals, kind of far and wide. We're a Microsoft partner, much like Cadence, which is good, and that allows us to have some really good integration with Microsoft 365, which we'll touch on later. One of the principal differences, really, or one of the values that we offer is just in terms of that kind of long-term storage. So, there's a whole load of governance which has increased over the years, and again, I'll touch on that later. But we've got some customers, Amnesty International as an example. They need to keep some of their legal assets into perpetuity. So we have a series of processes, tools, and our kind of proprietary technology that allows us to ensure that those records are both accessible, auditable, and again, the fact that we've been in this space for over 20 years, and we're now over the last few years extending into the Microsoft world to try and bring that technology from a much simpler lens. Our values as well, again, thought it was important to bring our values into it, as Adriano did with Cadence. So for us, it's very much around, protecting the data and ensuring that the data is always accessible. And again, I say we have a lot of key historic information that we retain. So our principle is, effectively, every file is precious, kind of keep it once, store forever, making sure that it's available and accessible well into the future, so people can, learn from that information as we keep it. So back to you, Adriano.
Excellent. Thanks, Neil. So now I'm gonna let's see if I can do this. Oh, will it let me?
Yeah.
Hopefully the slides are still visible. So I'm going to talk about, go on a little bit of a spiel now, and a little bit about those key issues that are currently facing organizations in SharePoint. What is telling people, or getting people to think that their SharePoint may not necessarily be stable, right? Now, stable is a strong word, and in some cases, it's not necessarily that SharePoint's going to stop working tomorrow, but people get worried that SharePoint isn't being used to its full potential. It's kind of a heap of stuff, and people don't know what to do about necessarily that heap of stuff. And as a result, it comes into this situation where people have to really try to at least attempt to get a grasp on what is in their SharePoint and how to make the best out of the SharePoint environment that they have. Ultimately, what it came down to was, over the course of the pandemic, over the course of the past 10 to 15 years, Microsoft's been pushing Microsoft 365 really hard. When you go to Microsoft and you say, hey, I want Office, they're going to say, hey, how about Microsoft 365? And as a result, as soon as you flip the switch on Microsoft 365, you get SharePoint, you get Teams in some cases, although not always, and you get OneDrive. And all these things become places where people put data. Great. But often what happened when that data storage location was turned on is that governance wasn't really in place. It was turned on and it was thrust onto people, and people started to collaborate, which is wonderful. But what that turned into is collaboration with some bad habits involved, right? And often when we go into new clients and we talk to new organizations, we hear of three key issues that are constantly at the top of people's minds. Key issue number one is that organizations and people got into a habit of piling instead of filing. filing was never top of mind. So it was just create a team, put a bunch of stuff in it, and never touch that team again, right? It was just a place to store things. And things weren't organized according to a file plan, according to department, anything like that. That is endemic of item number 2, which is, of course, a lack of ownership. People never linked or felt like they had control or a responsibility to control the teams that they created, the SharePoint sites they created, their OneDrives, or anything like that. That lack of ownership led to kind of a blurred line between what belongs to me, what belongs to the organization, what do I care about, what don't I care about. And often there wasn't a framework in place to teach people what they should be caring about and what they should be doing with the data that they put into Microsoft 365. And that's a lot of data, because if your IT department set it up in such a way where everything on your desktop syncs to your OneDrive, suddenly that's terabytes potentially of data synced to OneDrive without any type of framework or governance in place. And that all led to number 3, the expansion of the environment. Data just grew, right? And often it wasn't deleted, it wasn't taken care of. So that information just grew the size of Microsoft 365, grew what was stored in 365. And often a lot of these organizations come to us and they say, look, we have a ton of data in 365. We don't know how to handle it. We don't know how to work on it. We don't know what to do with it. So we just ignore it. We pack it away in the corner. We do the old put it in a box, put it in a closet, and don't touch it type of scenario, which I just moved. So I am living that life completely right now. A bunch of our stuff is just out of sight, out of mind. And ultimately, the biggest problem that I would say from a governance perspective exists is end users aren't feeling the pain. They have search, they know where to find their information, they have these super well connected spaces to collaborate. But anything that is out of sight, out of mind for them isn't going to affect their day-to-day. They know and learn how to get by in these environments that are disorganized or mismanaged because they have the solutions to be productive enough. And in a lot of cases, that's okay from a day-to-day perspective. But the pain is just below the surface. The pain that is going to happen in these environments is not necessarily the pain of the end user, but the pain of the administrators and the pain of the folks who have to deal with the growth of that environment. And that's why we like to say stable SharePoint, right? Because SharePoint might be stable from a day-to-day perspective, but there are things lurking under the surface, things away from the user's point of view that may be affecting how truly stable that whole tenant is. One of those pieces that lies below the surface that people might not be thinking about is that storage limit. And if you're not in IT, you may have never seen this graph before. But this graph is in the SharePoint Admin Center in the top right corner, front and center for people who are logging in to the Admin Center often. And generally speaking, it can be nerve-wracking for people to see this graph grow. Because what Microsoft does is when you buy a new Microsoft 365 tenant, they give you 1 terabyte of storage plus 10 gigabytes per named user. So this scale will often be different for every individual organization based on how many licenses you actually own. So this scale, though, once you reach that tip-top level, it doesn't affect performance. It starts to hit your wallet. Because every gigabyte that you go past that, in this case, 102 terabytes, costs you per month per gigabyte. The price might seem small, but if you have terabytes upon terabytes upon terabytes of content that begins to build up in the environment, suddenly you're looking at big costs from Microsoft. And the earlier problems that I talked about on the past slide of the piling instead of filing, and all these issues around that lack of ownership or that lack of understanding what data people are putting into 365 contributes to this space problem. Now, again, an end user is probably never going to notice this. They don't care. This is going to be that IT pain, the pain of the wallet hit and the pain of trying to manage this capacity. I'm working with a pharmaceutical company right now, and they are having this exact issue. This bar is right near the top, and they have tons of information that hasn't been touched in decades sitting in SharePoint. It was put into SharePoint because that's where it was before in an on-premise environment. And people didn't stop to think about, hey, what is this information? Or hey, what do we have? It was just put it in SharePoint and don't worry about it until the pain comes to the surface. The data that is the pain causing data, is what we term rot or riot data. And Neil introduced me to the term of riot, and I think that's a really interesting addition. You may have heard rot, though more commonly said in these types of spaces. So riot data can be everywhere, and riot stands for redundant, inaccessible, obsolete, or trivial information. Redundant being duplicates, obsolete being stuff that's so old we're never going to touch it again. Trivial being, I worked with an organization once where someone had a folder full of PDF recipes in a shared drive. I asked if I could receive a copy, but I wasn't allowed to, so that's kind of disappointing. But that is completely trivial, has nothing to do with business, has nothing to do with the operations. But also inaccessible is a really important one as well. And inaccessible meaning that there is stuff that may be of value on a site that no one has access to. Everyone who had access to that site has left the organization. And suddenly that data is just sitting there on a site that no one can touch because no one has realized it's there. Riot data has existed for years, for decades upon decades, ever since a shared drive became a reality. But it never really was a problem because, especially if it's inaccessible, out of sight, out of mind, right? No one was seeing it, no one was touching it, no one was using it. But in the world of AI, that becomes a bigger problem. In the world of enterprise search, that becomes a bigger problem because riot data shows up in search indexes. It shows up in Copilot responses. It shows up where we don't want it to show up. And if it's trivial, like those recipes, if it's obsolete, so old that it has no value, if it was inaccessible, but suddenly it's accessible, and most importantly, if it's redundant, it starts to put junk into those search indexes. It starts to put junk into Copilot responses, and it starts to affect people's day to day. So again, back to the earlier point, when it's below the surface, people aren't thinking about it. It's not front of mind. It's not actively causing pain for people. They aren't as motivated to go fix it. But when we're in this situation, when we have a situation where suddenly productivity, suddenly results are going to be affected by this information, it becomes a bit more visible to people. And as a result, you have people starting to ask questions of, what do we do about this information? And that'll come in a couple slides. Talking about inaccessibility for a second. That's a really important one, and I think really applies to this conversation because if you have data that suddenly isn't accessible, how do people get value from it with Copilot, without Copilot, whatever you might say? That inaccessibility that in the riot data becomes a bigger issue for a lot of people. And this is kind of two angles, right? So angle number one refers to something that I lovingly, as an Italian, call spaghetti permissions. Spaghetti permissions are, spaghetti is great when you're eating it with meatballs and tomato sauce, but it's not so great when you have these permission models that don't support how people need to work with information, right? So that lack of understanding, or that lack of control, that lack of governance, that lack of ownership results in potentially important data becoming inaccessible to people who need to access it. And there's also this thing in SharePoint that's called dark configuration. And that's something that is really important for organizations who have been using SharePoint for a long time, or who have transitioned from SharePoint on premises. Those dark configurations are things that Microsoft used to have that may have been enabled, that may affect the permissioning or ultimately the disposition of documents inside SharePoint, but aren't supported in SharePoint anymore. So they might still exist, they might still affect your information, but they're no longer a thing that you can affect. All of this stuff, again, a result of quick implementation, and an implementation that was, done out of necessity, not out of forethought and out of strategy, right? And those things exist in the background because, again, we're not thinking about them because they're invisible to the end user. People aren't screaming for it. People aren't visibly distraught by missing this certain type of information. So that type of, again, background issue is now only recently coming to the surface and affecting stability of the environment. The other thing I want to point out, of course, is that sometimes you have these really important records that are stored on a site that no one has access to, that are also in a format that doesn't actually render in SharePoint. And I've seen that happen in a couple organizations who have, again, migrated from on-premise SharePoint and not paid attention to what they were migrating. SharePoint Online only has 250 to 270 different file formats supported in their viewer. And if you're number 271 on that list, you're kind of out of luck. There's no really way to make SharePoint view it, especially if that application is not integrated with SharePoint. Now, the pieces that I want to be clear about is as we progress into how do we fix these problems? How do we actually get rid of spaghetti permissions and dark configuration and make sure data stays accessible when it needs to, but we get rid of everything that doesn't need to be? We start to look at, a whole new world of things that are available to us to increase stability and help prevent all these problems that become common for all these organizations. So diving deeper into that, let's talk about what some of those strategies are. The first thing I want to come to is cleanup. And realistically, riot data, the best way to get a handle on redundant, obsolete, and trivial specifically is to start cleaning up that information that we no longer need. Now, you might think to yourself, oh, that's going to be a ton of work. There's no way my organization can take that on. It's just not possible. There's not enough time in a day for us to deal with that. You might be right. And that's why manual business knowledge isn't the best solution for every organization, quite frankly. That's a capacity issue. That's potentially a knowledge gap issue. There's a lot of issues with that. But that is a tactic. It's available. But that's only one of the three that you see on the screen because it's not the only tactic that's available to people. Tactic number 2 starts to go into what we call pattern matching. It adds automation. Knowing what types of patterns we're looking for in data help us to identify important types of data, help us to call out different valuable types of information, and make sure they get organized properly. And now, more recently, we start to get into a new class of tools called AI-enabled classification tools. Large language models and AI have come a long way at being able to understand context. And in training an AI how to better understand our information in the context of our business, we can then say, hey, I have this document. What is this? And it can go through the training that we've provided it to spit out what it thinks that document is, which can then be used to help organize and manage the content later. I'll give the asterisk, of course, the disclaimer that it's not perfect. AI is not perfect at this point. We are, seeing a lot of very, very quick advancements in the tools, but it gives us at least a starting point. We might still need human in the loop, and that's okay, but the effort of a human goes way down if the AI does a bunch of that analysis first. So being able to potentially combine all three of these into one solution in the middle there can help us tackle that RIOT, the riot data problem in our environment that was caused by, again, rapid implementation with a lack of governance that resulted in people piling data into the system. So once we get past cleaning up the sins of the past, we then get into the goal, the ideal state of having what we call an information architecture. And this is just an example of an information architecture. Basically, the idea of information architecture is to create a structure so there is a home for everything and people know where that home is. Instead of having to wonder, hey, is there a place where HR data goes? If not, maybe I should just create a team and then put data in a team and then it just exists. We have a fixed HR team and that has all the HR information stored in a structured way, in a way that everyone understands. Taking time to go back and build an information architecture can be a lot of work, but it helps to define what that structure looks like and what those homes should be for your content and for your defined types of information. A lot of organizations say, God, it's going to be so hard for me to go back and assign all my existing sites into this architecture. And we always say, no, don't do that. One, don't touch those sites. Just leave them there. We'll deal with them with rot cleanup in the future. That's okay. But we're going to start net new from fresh. We're going to create this structure the way that it needs to be created from a blank slate. In your environment, build it out, test it out, and make it what it needs to be. And then as we do that, you'll then have the chance to file your important data back into this structure as needed as time goes on. And eventually you'll be left with all those old sites, all those old places that will have been picked through, and only the trivial stuff will be left. And you'll be comfortable to be able to delete those in the future. It doesn't have to be a snap pivot. It can be a slow, gradual process to get yourself into this structure so that you reap the benefits of having a fixed, well-defined structure that is easier to govern and manage. And as you go throughout this structure, permissions are going to be a very key feature of this. Metadata, retention labels, all of that kind of stuff gets built in here. And as a result of getting built in, we have that governance control at a more granular level everywhere, and no longer get into the situations that I talked about at the beginning. People are no longer piling data. People are no longer suffering from a lack of ownership because this structure gets put into place. And we'll talk more about information architecture throughout this series of webinars. This is such an important topic for us. But once you get past the architecture itself, what can you do? Well, that architecture gives us essentially what boils down to 4 key capabilities to help prevent the growth of riot data in the future. The first one is retention. It allows us to destroy data appropriately, on schedule, safely, and securely. In doing so, we prevent obsolete data from taking over. We make sure that anything that becomes obsolete gets trashed at an appropriate amount of time, whether that's legislative or business. We can get rid of it at a safe period of its life. Sensitivity helps us to protect data. So this allows us to use sensitivity labeling to identify important data and make sure that it's secure and accessible when necessary. That helps to prevent the inaccessibility problem and also helps to prevent potentially even exfiltration of data out of your environment when it's not appropriate. Similarly, the permissions model, defined really strongly, hopefully based on roles and groups if we're following best practice, will make sure that data remains accessible and data remains in the hands of people who need it and doesn't suddenly become, again, subject to spaghetti permissions or issues down the road. And finally, we can start to take care of archival. And archival is an important thought for 2 reasons. One, archival helps us maintain that long-term accessibility to data, reducing the problem of inaccessibility, reducing the problem of spaghetti permissions, and reducing the problem of dark configurations, on top of even reducing the problem of file formatting compatibility with SharePoint Online. But the second piece there is it helps us reduce the usage of storage. By putting it into cold storage, we can actually help IT solve their issue of not having stuff in SharePoint storage anymore, reducing usage and ultimately reducing cost. So these four things help us to reduce the pain point in the background. Now you're probably asking yourself, if you put all this into place, well, my users are going to be angry, right? My users are going to have their lives upended by all of this. The key part that I'll say to you about this whole transition is change management is important. People should feel like they're being brought along for the ride instead of this being forced on them. And that is an important tool in your tool belt as you try to execute this change on a big scale. Now, obviously, users should be a part of the design, and that helps them feel like they are attached to and are willing to use it a little bit more effectively. Again, we can go a long time on change management and the value of how that transition needs to be inclusive of your people and needs to be ultimately informed by your people. But that, again, I'll leave for another webinar, because these topics, while intertwined, don't have the time to go to the depth they deserve today. But ultimately, again, once we get it into that architecture, once we build the pyramid, a lot of the issues, a lot of the problems, a lot of the pain that was just below the surface can be resolved. Copilot queries are going to be higher quality because we'll have gotten rid of the stuff we no longer need to keep. And we ultimately have, prevented the end user from experiencing that pain, but also prevented IT from continuing to have their pain increase, preventing governance from continuing to have their pain increase as time progresses on without dealing with these problems. So now let's drill deeper onto this fourth one. That archival piece is something that has a very dear place in my heart, not only because of this specific topic, but because it is a really important part of that long-term accessibility and about reducing the IT side of the storage pain as time progresses. So with that, I will pass it over to Neil to go on a little bit of a deeper dive into Preserve 365, how that works with Microsoft 365, and how that helps with the archival question.
Perfect, brilliant, thank you. I was really interested in Adriano. Preservica has been around, kind of developing, deploying with customers utilizing our technology for over 20 years. And effectively what we've done is, since the Microsoft ecosystem's got bigger and bigger, and obviously it's progressed to the point now where it is, I think, the most widely used collaborative space, certainly across most enterprise organizations. It felt only right that basically we develop a connector, for want of a better word, but it's an embedded application that allows customers to transfer their high-value digital assets from Microsoft, from SharePoint, into the Preservica core backend. So historically, and through other systems and file systems, again, much like Adriana was saying, that it would follow a typical process of getting it out of one solution into a bucket somewhere where you might FTP it, or number of issues with that, effectively principally around maintenance of access control lists and created date and kind of the key metadata that is really quite critical to the managing of the data in the long term. So long story short, we effectively created Preserve 365, which allows us to, through a series of embedded apps and trusted links and authentication, all kinds of clever stuff. It allows us to take what is effectively our secret sauce, active digital preservation, and bring it right into Microsoft. So why is that important? You may ask yourself, and most people do. So over the last 10 years, as you can see from the statistics on the screen, and again, as cloud-based technologies, SaaS solutions, software as a service solutions have grown, so has the governance requirements around, you need to keep these plans for X amount of year. Then they didn't really focus quite as heavily as they did when they were more paper-based. obviously now it's digital, it's much easier to keep things. And so as you can see from some of the kind of the numbers in the top right hand corner of the various different verticals, there is, at a minimum, typically 10 plus governance requirements around how data should be governed, how it should be kept, and for how long it needs to be accessible for. And again, over the last 10 years, it's grown by 340%, which seems like a ridiculous percentage. But again, that just goes to show that a lot of organizations that we deal with have got data that needs to meet a very specific governance requirement, and they just don't even know. And unfortunately, I mean, I'm not sure whether ignorance is the right word or not, but not being aware of a governance issue or not being aware of the fact that this needs to be kept for X long in a certain mechanism won't mitigate the various different fines when they come your way, and some of them are just absolutely ridiculous. So we try to simplify this out as much as we possibly can, and as I say, we do that through a combination of different things. So one of the ways that we do that is active digital preservation. So this is trademark, it's patented, it's patent pending in some countries and patent passed in others. It's a whole thing. But basically, this is our secret sauce. It's a perpetual model where we effectively go through the process of analysing the files right the way down to the bits of those files. We go through a migration process, and then, as I say, we perpetually review that. So what does that look like? So when we first ingest files, we'll do all the fixity checksums, take all the values, we do the antivirus checking, all of that kind of stuff. And effectively what we're doing at that point is assuring that the data is in a fit, reliable state, that the checksums effectively match what the file is saying, and there's no differences in size and this, that, and the other. So once we've got that in our system, we replicate it about, and then we go through a process of migration. So we keep the original into the file in whatever format that is. We create an access copy, which is a lightweight web renderable version, and then we have a preservation master as well, which is like a highest quality, nearest to the original. And effectively what that helps us do is, in some industries, in some verticals, so NARA is a standard that is quite relatable here. So they have, so in America, they have a requirement whereby when everything comes through to the National Archive, it has to be stored in a particular format. And that is this NARA standard. Effectively, what we have in the back end is we have a series of different templates that says, right, take this Word document and make it a PDF, or take this real media file and make it an MP4. So we have a series of defaults, but also ultimately what we can do is take a file format, keep the original, and then make a viewable version in whatever format either you need or somebody else needs for governance. And as I say, the value of that, just as part of what we do in terms of the preserving those assets, is that they're always accessible. So again, we've got some customers that have legal documents, and basically one of the reasons that they ultimately came with us in the end was there was a legal instance, they needed this particular information and they couldn't get it because they just simply could not find the technology to facilitate the opening of these legal records, and that caused significant issue to them, and that effectively was part of the problem statement. And ultimately why they went with Preservica, which is, as I say, is great, and it's a really good customer and a really good story. But as I say, we review that into perpetuity, and effectively that means that those files should always be accessible. And I'd say the other thing as well, which actually quite surprised me, is that we very much see ourselves as custodians of data. So when I've worked in the Microsoft sphere historically, a lot of third-party technologies, like whether it's kind of a cloud-based email hygiene services, getting your data in is one thing, getting your data out is something else. And there are normally egress charges. We see ourselves as custodians of your data. So if you want to take your data, we will effectively just give you, you say, well, where do you want it? We download it and off you go. There's no cost associated to that, which I personally think is really good and kind of circles back round to the kind of our value proposition, if you like, or our key values at the start of the call. But where do we sit? So you'll see backup archive and then preserve 365 kind of dump right on the end. So backup and data protection are really short-term solutions. I think that's how we would typically see it across the market. So backups historically, I know organizations go through a kind of a grandfather process of storing monthly, yearly backups. Tapes degrade over time, therefore they aren't reliable, and that's the same with digital backups as well, or data protection, snapshots, all that kind of stuff. Unless you have a fairly rigorous backup recovery process, they are prone to failure, a higher rate than you would probably think. And then when you need to start retaining things for the medium term, that's where tiered storage comes into play. So again, like Adriano was talking around earlier, you don't want all of your data, all of that riot, all of that rot that's not really driving value to you as an organization. You don't want that in your primary tier of storage. SharePoint storage is literally the most expensive storage on the planet. So anywhere else is going to be cheaper. And therefore what you need to do is manage what goes where based on kind of the value of that data. So archive is a cheaper tier of storage, doesn't really offer any other value other than the fact it's saving you money. And then we come in, so we see ourselves as long term. So effectively any record that needs to be retained really, 5-7 years plus, and again that's into perpetuity, we would see that is where we start adding value. We use Azure, so everything sits within the Microsoft ecosystem, and we effectively can leverage either hot, which is default, or cooler tiers of storage for cost saving against data that you wouldn't access very frequently. But the predominance of our customers keep everything in Azure hot blob storage. But again, that is a fraction of the cost of SharePoint storage. So even by simply moving things across, you're getting all the value of the immutable storage and the logs of who accesses what and where, and all of the other great features and functions that we'll come to in a bit more depth in some of the other webinars a bit further down the line. But yeah, principally backup, short term, for like bricks level, restoring mailboxes and in particular files. Archive is you've got your chunks of data. I don't think there's much value in them, but I dare not delete them. So I'm going to put them in a cheaper tier of storage and forget about them. And then preserve 365, those high value digital assets that you're going to need governance around, and some kind of assurance that it's going to be there and accessible into the future. So just building on, again, what Adriano was saying earlier in terms of the information architecture. So we support role-based access control in much the same way that you would look to deploy permissions across sites. And again, like Adriano was saying earlier, the great thing about AI is it is fantastic at saving time. It doesn't do everything, and again, I always like the way that Microsoft called Copilot, because it doesn't pilot. It doesn't get you to where you want to go, and it gets you part way there. So that's why it's called Copilot, which I always thought was quite good. But effectively, what we're doing is we are transitioning from looking at that whole structure to effectively looking at the elements that are going to have data that need to be retained for the long term. So we support files, folders, site lists, libraries, anything at any level of granularity that sits within SharePoint, and that obviously includes team sites and OneDrive and all that kind of fancy stuff. We've got a pretty rigorous roadmap of features and functions that we release with pretty regular cadence. So yeah, it's there. There's, we work with Microsoft actually. I mean, it's probably a good thing to point out as well. So we work with the content team. So that's Microsoft's own archive and backup team. And we've actually helped them in terms of some of their file level functionality, which they don't currently have at the moment, but are planning to release soon. We do have a better together message with Microsoft. So obviously, we can go from simplicity from the far left to more complicated in terms of integration points on the far right. From a very simplistic, you can just right click a file and do copy or move. We stub on a move, so that is a space saving. Those files are still accessible. And again, it's basically only to users that are in the appropriate role-based access control group for Preserve 365. And those that have permissions to access that data before it's moved. We also act as a security demarcation point for AI technology. So again, if you were to run a Copilot query across data, a number of our customers have used it to accelerate their journey to Copilot, because that high value digital assets that they've kind of identified, they can move it to using Preserve 365. Copilot can't gain access to it, but through the use of stubs, the users that had access before can still access it. So that is a good accelerator to AI technologies within Microsoft. We have full extensibility with Microsoft Purview from a records lifecycle management process. We have 2 Power Automate connectors that are in the premium store, so that's move and copy, obviously. And then we've got a number of Copilot agents as well, from a kind of an art of the possible, that can do everything from going away querying metadata to, who created this, last accessed, you name it. And again, back to Adriana's point earlier, really, with regards to Copilot, it's around simplifying and accelerating the mechanism for finding that data and then moving it into Preservica effectively, where you can get that benefit from it. So, and the automation for me is the bit that actually drives the value for customers. Being able to do something that's just more than right click and copy, but driving that scale. And again, we've got a lot of banks that are now starting to enter into the Copilot testing phase as well. So it's a really interesting place in time that we're at. And finally, just to bang the drum a little bit more about our relationship with Microsoft, Preserve 365 was built in collaboration with Microsoft, and again, we work with the content team to ensure that, as I say, all of the security permissions, all of the access control lists are all maintained. All of the data is encrypted at rest and in transit. Yeah, I mean, it's an implicit trust relationship effectively between the customers, Microsoft tenant, and ours. And that allows, as I say, just encryption at every single touch point. So later, as we come into some of the demos in the future, so we'll start putting this into practice and showing you what it looks like visually. But yeah, really at that point, it's as I say, it's and again, I guess touching back on the adoption change management point, Adriana, that you're talking around earlier as well. The reason why we've kind of incorporated it into SharePoint and the search index and all that kind of stuff in the way that we have is to really kind of reduce that adoption change management approach. So it's users using a familiar interface to either browse to a file where they know it is and click on a stub, which looks and is called exactly the same as the original file, or using the SharePoint search index to go away and find files. But again, I say we'll bring the reality of that to action in a later session. We'll actually show you what that looks like. But for me, that's it. So Adriana, I think we'll probably loop you back in at this point.
Excellent. So we are going to turn this into a webinar series. Obviously, these topics are very important and top of mind for a lot of organizations. So we're going to do one on SharePoint storage and how to manage SharePoint online capacity using Preserve 365 as an engine to reduce storage. The second one will be two-stage records management in SharePoint Online. So for public sector institutions or institutions that want to do a semi-active state, we can definitely get deeper into how it can go to Preserve 365 in the interim to take it out of hot storage, but still retain it for a certain period of time. And the last one will be more focused on the public sector, which will be preservation of public records specifically in 365 and how public records can be maintained indefinitely, but still within the Microsoft 365 world and still accessible from SharePoint Online, Teams, and such. So these topics are kind of going to grow on what we built in today, and built on the foundation that we've started today. But ultimately, what we're trying to, I think, get to you today is information about SharePoint is this very dynamic, very complex beast, and sometimes it takes a little help to get it to a point where it's manageable, governable, and where the content inside is protected, safe, and ultimately made sure that it is accessible and usable in every way possible for end users, whether that's Copilot or just standard collaboration. So obviously we've done a lot of talking today and there's a lot of information in here. It doesn't look like there's any Q&A in the chat. So with that, I think we'll just cap off and say thank you for your time and thank you for attending. We really appreciate being able to speak on these topics. As you can tell, me and Neil are both very passionate and very focused on these types of topics. And we look forward to bringing you more content in the future. So thank you again, and we'll distribute the recording. And if you have any questions afterwards, please feel free to reach out by email in response to the invite or directly to Cadence or to Preservica as well. Thank you very much and have a great day.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Great speaking to you. Thanks, Adriano.
Thanks, Neil.
Bye.